My special guest today is Glenn Greenwald. He's a journalist, an author, a lawyer, and he's also the host of System Update. Why do you think, we were talking about this yesterday with Claire Daly. We're seeing numerous protests across the globe. Internationally, those protests, I'm seeing thousands of people out in the streets. I haven't seen that since the George Floyd protest here in the US. And it's been really difficult, to be honest, to get people to come out and protest. We're lucky if we get like 50 people. Why do you think countries like Brazil, countries like Peru, they're able to get thousands of people out in the streets to protest and push back against, corporate interests? But in the US, we seem to struggle to get that to happen.
I mean, why isn't there an American Claire Daly or Mick Wallace? I keep encouraging people to follow their Twitter accounts. You watch them every day in the EU Parliament. These are like old school Irish leftists. Mm-hmm. And you watch them, you stand up, and they say things every day that, is total basic staple of left-wing politics that you would never, ever hear out of the mouth of AOC or Bernie Sanders. Talking about like systemic critiques of capitalism, imperialism, militarism, the role of the EU and the United States in that, the blame they bear for it. And I think one of the difficulties is, in order to have street protests, you need to have people who have lost faith in the political process, in the political system, that none of the parties there really are serving your interests. And no matter who you vote for, it doesn't make a difference in your life. And this is why I find the work that you guys do and others do who are critiquing the Squad and Bernie so critical, because I think that the most valuable assets that the Democratic Party has, and therefore the corporate interests that the Democratic Party serves — remember, they're funded by Wall Street, by Silicon Valley, by Big Pharma, all those people fund the Democratic Party. What Bernie and AOC and the Squad do more than anything else is they tell people, they deceive people into believing you don't need to go out into the streets. We have this party for you right here. All you need to do is keep voting for us, keep voting for Democrats, and eventually you're going to get the change that you want. They create this fake channel or path that they tell people will ultimately lead to the kinds of radical and fundamental changes that they want. And so they take all this energy that could be devoted to street protests. I've seen that before, not just in George Floyd, but remember, Occupy Wall Street was a very real, sustained street movement in the wake of the Wall Street crisis and Wall Street bailouts. I visited dozens of encampments across the country until they crushed them through courts and legal force. And that's because people have become so disillusioned with Obama that they turn their disillusion into protest energy. When you have people like AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley and Jamal Bowman and Hakeem Jeffries, now the hero of them all, and Bernie Sanders saying to people, no, we're the party that's really taking on the special interest and corporate interest, people trust them and they believe them, and they think that the solution lies in voting and the political process and not in street protest or more radical action. And that's the reason I find that group so threatening.
I agree. I feel like they've killed some of that energy, like, so to speak.
For sure.
Yeah, I just think of all the things that we could have done if we weren't just relying on that one strategy. I'm curious. You were lucky to interview AOC. I think it was just you and Jimmy Dore that I saw interview her outside of mainstream media. AOC and the rest of them, to be honest, they have not appeared on left independent media since, with the exception of Ilhan Omar and Jamal Bowman have been on Majority Report. But other than that, they don't come on.
That's like MSNBC. Let's face it.
Yeah, it's like they don't come onto these outlets anymore. And had it not been for your show and for Jimmy Dore's show, I wouldn't have even known who AOC was when she was running. That's how I found out about her. I like looking back at those interviews, I really believed AOC. Part of this is my fault because I feel like I should have done more like research about her. Later on, I found out her story was not completely true about her background, etc. At that point in time, when you interviewed her, did you believe AOC? during that interview when she came
Hell
onto your
yeah. Hell
show?
yeah. I didn't just believe her. I was enthused by her. I was impressed with her. I was excited about her. I encourage people to donate to her campaign. It's kind of like a no-no in journalism. I've done that on like a few occasions, though, when I've really gotten excited by somebody. I get behind them and I say, this person can actually change things. I remember, Sabby, the way I learned about AOC was Ryan Grimm, who pays close attention to that wing of the Democratic politics. I mean, that's his job, for better for worse. He, has a lot of fans and a lot of detractors. I'll leave that to the side. He's a good friend of mine. I don't feel comfortable critiquing his work because of that friendship. But he called me up and he said, look, I know you're pretty much done with Democrats, but I promise you're going to like this one candidate I have for you. She's a challenger to Joe Crowley, one of the worst scumbags in Washington. I had looked at her Twitter feed, and like the last tweet I had seen was something where she said, I will no longer allow the Democratic Party to treat the Palestinians like dirt anymore and support Israel. This is enough. I was like, all right, I'm interested. And I spent a good 45 minutes to an hour with her in that interview because she didn't have any media attention. No one was interested in AOC. No one knew who she was. There was like a small number of alternative media paying attention to that primary race. So she was willing to talk to anybody. And I really kick the tires hard. I've been around a long time. I know politicians will deceive you, and a lot of them are talented at it. Mm-hmm. So I felt like I really, examined that. I asked like very probing questions. I wanted to see how much substance was behind these slogans, whether she had really there was like a developed thought structure to the things she was saying she believed in. And there was. I really left that interview impressed. And it is amazing. Like not only will AOC, of course, not appear, but I have probably done more to defend Ilhan Omar than almost anybody. Every single time she's demonized and attacked by conservative media, I'm right there, defending her. The first time she really got into trouble was when she responded to one of my tweets. I, had saw some Republican demanding more money to Israel. And I said, isn't it amazing how politicians who get elected by American voters end up instead devoting so much of their time and passion to a foreign country? And that was when she said, it's all about the Benjamins, baby. And that was like her first anti-Semitic scandal. And I was like, that is not anti-Semitism. That's observing the fact that there are a lot of powerful lobbies in Washington. The NRA is one, big tech's another, Wall Street's another, the Israel lobby is another. And it's insane to demand that people pretend that's not true. And yet, I've asked her on my show several times since we launched. And at first she said, oh, I'll go on, but I'm just trying to take it easy toward the end of the year. I was like, totally understand. Have a good vacation. 2 days later, I saw her on Mehdi Hassan's show on MSNBC. And then since then, she just, doesn't have any more excuses left and won't come on because they will not come on with anybody who will ask them hard questions, not from the right, but about their professed values and the glaring inconsistencies between those professed values and their actions in Congress. And they know I'm going to do that. And they will never come on my show or anyone's show who will ask them those questions.
Do you think she knows, or maybe not just her, but the squad in general, do you think they know that people are pretty upset with them?
It's really interesting. They definitely know. I mean, you've seen Ilhan Omar and AOC, get confronted in places, and you've seen them start to lash out at the left. This is always the tell. Is what happens is, these are the people who start off with the left, throwing rocks at the DC establishment, complaining that the left wing of the Democratic Party is not doing enough, is co-opted, etc. And then they get elected, and then they have this big office, and they have a staff, and they're well known, and they get on committees, and they get to go on shows. And now suddenly they're the ones on the inside with the power, and they start hearing critiques from the left. And instead of sitting down with them and saying, you know what, you're my allies, I want to hear your critiques. What am I doing wrong? You start to see them getting very arrogant and increasingly very hostile, almost like, how dare you criticize me from the left? And I think that they start thinking is the left is too kind of simplistic to not understand the game they're playing and the sophistication of that game. And you start to see their greatest hostility increasingly reserved for the left, more and more and more and more. And I think you're absolutely starting to see that now from various members of the squad. They absolutely know people are disappointed with them and angry at them, but they don't care because they think that that criticism is completely unjustifiable, ignorant. And I think they also think that where do those people have to go? Nowhere. So who cares at the end of the day if the left is angry at them?
Do you think that people should fight for third parties and independent candidates in the US, or do you think it's a waste of time? Because to answer that question, like where do people go? We've been telling people like start voting for third party candidates, vote for independent candidates, anything outside of the duopoly. Do you think that's worth it, or do you think people should focus on something else, like more like direct action?
So on the presidential level, it's essentially impossible to run a viable third-party candidacy except if you're a billionaire. The only person who did it in my lifetime was Ross Perot, who at times was leading the polls when he was running against George Bush the first and Bill Clinton in 1992. Ended up, I forget, with 20% of the vote, something significant. Bill Clinton probably won because Ross Perot divided the right. But Ross Perot was a billionaire. There was a candidate, a congressman from Illinois, John Anderson. He was kind of quirky. He, for a while, did pretty well as a third-party candidate in the polls when Jimmy Carter ran against Ronald Reagan, but ultimately, I think, got 6% of the vote, something like that. So the structural barriers, if you're not a billionaire, are so overwhelming. Like, I think Michael Bloomberg could have probably won, and I think he would have run had Bernie gotten the nomination. It had been Bernie versus Trump, and maybe would have won. So I don't think if the only solution is let's get behind a billionaire, that's a very promising solution. One of the things the right did really well, I'm talking about like the anti-establishment right, the part of the right that hates the establishment wing of the Republican Party, is they devoted themselves to building from the ground up. So like school boards, city council races. What is I forget her name. I met her 10 years ago. I knew she was going to be a star. The city councilwoman in Seattle who's a socialist who decided. Yeah.
Shama Sawant. Yep.
Exactly. So there's an example. I know her district. I went to her district. I interviewed her 10 years ago. I feel terrible that I forgot her name. But, I remember her telling me her strategy, which is like, there's a lot of leftists. We think it can be a low turnout election. If I recall correctly, even though she ran that on the Democratic Party ticket, though, but still, she's like a real socialist. She never got co-opted. She never changed. So I think that's where it's valuable. Electoral politics is like building local races. I think it's really worth it. There's a lot of power in county commissions. And, the DSA has actually done reasonably well with that in like the New York State Assembly, the New York State Senate, changing the balance of power. Like you see some examples where it can be successful if you have the right places, the right localities, the right elections. So I wouldn't write it off entirely. I think the problem with just creating a third party that's intended to compete on the national level is it's basically structurally impossible. So I think the combination of, I also think there's some viable ways to still take it over from the inside. It's just every time you try, the Democratic Party is very good at even taking the best of the people and breaking them. Or in the case of, say, someone like Cynthia McKinney, who didn't get broken, they just get rid of her. Yeah. So I would pretty much devote a lot less energy on electoral politics and a lot more on internet shows, independent media, direct action, and then some local organizing in the right places. I think that's the winning combination.